As Chief Executive of the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney, it is indeed a very, very great pleasure to welcome all of you here, and especially to welcome our distinguished speaker to this Alliance 21 event. The Alliance 21 program is part of the Center's overall mandate to deepen awareness and understanding about the United States and about the U.S.-Australia relationship, both in Australia and abroad. And we do this in three broad areas. We do a great deal of education and training at the University of Sydney, and soon in cooperation with our sister institution at the University of Western Australia in Perth. Secondly, we conduct a good amount of what we call thought leadership and public outreach, like events like this here. And we also carry out research analysis and publishing on important issues related to the United States and to U.S.-Australia relations. The Alliance 21 program, which we think of primarily as one of our research and analysis activities, is one of our most ambitious undertakings. It's a multi-year effort. It directly involves some 60 U.S. and Australian experts and a range of activities taking place in the United States, across the United States and across Australia. And we've divided the work of the Alliance 21 program into 6 main themes, including trade and investment, education and innovation, natural resources and the environment, energy security, defense, and emerging Asia. And it is under the theme of emerging Asia that we are meeting this afternoon. I think as everyone in the audience is well aware, the strategic future for Australia, as well as for the United States, depends intensely on how we are able to manage our interests in this increasingly dynamic, indeed the most dynamic, of global regions in Asia. And perhaps most importantly in this calculus is going to be how our countries manage their relationship with China. China is a country with which both Australia and the United States share a range of interests, whether they be economic, environmental, indeed strategic, and many other areas. And it's also a country with which our two countries, in their respective bilateral relationship with China, have an intensive, and I would say largely productive, set of ties. But nevertheless, we also know that there are enormous challenges to our relationship with China. There are deep divisions, indeed, across a number of important issues involving our interests and involving our values. I think Australia and the United States have a lot to learn from one another, both having deep and rich experiences in engaging with China, both having deep and rich experiences engaging with an emerging Asia. And we're not always going to agree with one another, but I suspect the depth and breadth of our relationship, cutting across not just security issues, but the full range of topics which we're covering in the Alliance 21 project, form the kind of foundation of trust and understanding between ourselves where we can indeed learn how we can best work together to assure our interests and values are sustained as we engage in emerging Asia, as we engage in emerging China. It is fitting then, I think, that we are able then today to welcome the Honorable Dr. Kurt Campbell to discuss the topic of U.S.-Australia-China triangle. It is, for me, a very, very special honor to welcome you here, Kurt. Kurt is a colleague and a friend with whom I've had the pleasure of working for many, many years. And he is in the midst, I should say, in the very middle of what is an ongoing, very distinguished and successful career as a policy intellectual, a think tank leader, a businessman, and of course a senior public official. Most recently, Kurt stepped down as the Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, where among many, many other accomplishments in a 4-year stint and hundreds of thousands of air miles traveled in this region, he was a key figure in a number of important developments for American Asia policy. Not least, of course, reinvigorating our alliance relationships in the region, rebuilding an effective American diplomatic presence in the region, helping orchestrate the remarkable opening of relations with Burma, keeping a steady hand in managing a stable and productive relationship with China, and I think perhaps most famously being a key figure in the rebalancing policy of the United States towards Asia. I think for all of that, we couldn't expect a better person to be able to speak to us here today on the issues of U.S., Australia, China, and its strategic triangle and implications for the future. Thanks again for coming, Kurt. We're very glad you could join us.
Thank you very much, Bates. It's tremendous to be here. Great to be back in Sydney. A little bit different circumstances. I spent the last 4 years serving at the State Department, and I'm out of government for about a month. This is my first trip since I've left. I was in Northeast Asia, and I came down here. And just to give you a sense of what that's like as you transition out of government, in our system, people go in for a while. It's usually an incredibly intensive experience. For me, it was 4 years, about 80 trips to Asia during that period of time. That's about one every 10 or so days. Every country in the region, many other trips to Europe and elsewhere to discuss Asian development. So it's incredibly intense. And then you leave, and it's a very different set of experiences, right? So at the State Department, you have hundreds, really thousands of people that are taking care of you. And then when you leave, it's suddenly a very different set of experiences. I have a whole slew of young daughters at home. And as I was getting ready for this trip, my 10-year-old was, I don't think she meant it, was meaner to me than any North Korean diplomat ever was. And so I'm sitting at the table, kind of anxiously trying to get my stuff together. And she looked at me, and she's 10, and she says, "You know, Papa, you're a mess." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You don't know how to work any of your technology, and you're losing things, and you don't have any more support, and you have no friends anymore." I said, I do too know how to use, I know how to use the interlube, and I look at my devices and stuff, and anyway, it's a wonderful experience to make the transition out, to be able to sort of think deeply about issues. I'll be writing a book about the last several years, the chance to work with President Obama and Secretary Clinton, in really, as Bates suggested, a consequential time. It's not lost on any of you that basically over the course of the last 15 years, the United States has been involved in the deepest, most difficult set of challenges in the Middle East and South Asia that have been draining and difficult, and they've cost us enormous blood and treasure, but also some prestige. And now we're in a set of circumstances that, again, as Bates indicated, it is well recognized in strategic corridors in the United States, in Australia, in Europe, basically everywhere, that the history, the lion's share of the history of the 21st century will be written in the Asian Pacific region. And that we must do everything we can to pivot, rebalance, choose your appropriate word, to spend more time focus on this incredibly important arena. And in a sense, American foreign policy has always been well established in the Asian Pacific region. But if anything, over the course of the period ahead, we have to be more determined, we have to put more focus, and make a determined effort to ensure that every aspect of diplomacy, of multilateral engagement, of military practice, that the United States is a key player in all of that going forward. For me, when I look back over the 4 years that I served, there were some incredible developments. We did, as Bates indicated, open engagement with Burma, with Myanmar, a very challenging set of circumstances, almost impossible to imagine 4 years ago that we had absolutely no contact with this country for almost 50 years. And now we're in a set of circumstances where we are working on a daily basis, not just with the government, but with Aung San Suu Kyi, trying to plot and track a new course for that country going forward. We've had a lot of remarkable developments with our friends in China, some challenges and some issues that will be very difficult for my and our successors in government, particularly in North Korea, as we see more and more provocative activities and behavior on the part of the current government there. What we've seen in terms of U.S.-Australian relations is really quite remarkable. And here is a classic example of a deep bipartisan commitment in both countries to a strong relationship. There is the mechanism that essentially guides our foreign policy and national security. It is called the OSMAN, and for the first time in basically 50 years, we were able to hold each one at the highest levels and have a very consequential set of discussions on every aspect of our relationship, including defense issues, and of course, when President Obama visited, announced a deeper set of ties, which will involve some stationing, positioning, and moving forces, American forces through Australia, deeper discussions on intelligence matters and cybersecurity. Frankly, much deeper discussions about key regional issues like challenges in Indonesia, changes in China. So we've had really the deepest possible set of relations between our two countries. And I fully expect, no matter who's in government here in Australia, that that process will continue, just as it would continue after an election in the United States. And so we are thrilled by what we've been able to accomplish, and we expect more of that going forward. I will say that what we have found, perhaps more than any other country, is the ability of Australia at key junctures to give remarkably helpful and insightful advice. To just give you some examples of that, when the United States was making some decisions about how to position itself with respect to what we would call multilateral diplomacy, what institutions to join, really it was Kevin Rudd more than any other individual meeting directly with the Secretary of State, with the President, that guided us in the direction of joining the East Asia Summit and thought carefully about how APEC, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, these sound like alphabet soups of diplomacy, but they're remarkably important for the 21st century. If you think about Asia generally, it is primarily based on bilateral relationships. There is remarkably little multilateralism, but that process is beginning and growing rapidly. And if multilateralism is successful in Asia in the way it was in Europe in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, I think we can imagine a set of circumstances where there's a much greater chance at peace and stability and dealing with difficult challenges in a collaborative way as opposed to one country versus another. Australia also was remarkably helpful on some transitions in Southeast Asia generally, including Burma, Myanmar. Probably no country has helped us more in terms of interpreting developments in Indonesia as Australia. And of course, what we've had more recently are deep discussions about China. Now, it is often the case in Australia that I think Australians tend to not recognize how deep and sustained American commitment is to working with China. And I just want to underscore to the group here today that for the United States, probably the most important foreign policy goal of the 21st century is to figure out how to work together to coexist with China in the Asia-Pacific region. It is extraordinarily important that we find ways to work together, to cooperate. For the United States, this is the most complex relationship that we've ever had and that we will ever have. It is completely different than the relationship we had with the Soviet Union for 50 years. That was a black and white, monochromatic set of relations. The U.S.-China relationship is remarkably varied, extraordinarily distinct. It has elements of cooperation and elements of competition. Both sides of that equation are vivid and important, and it leads to, indeed, a set of circumstances in which no issue today on the global stage does not touch the U.S.-China relationship. What we have seen in the last several months is a remarkable transition in China, a new set of leaders who are just now choosing their foreign policy team that will be responsible for managing relations not only with the United States, but Australia as well. We are getting to know slowly the new leaders. Xi Jinping came to the United States as a guest of Vice President Biden. I was with him on that entire trip. We also went to China to interact with him, so we had a chance to sit down and get to know him a little bit. I think it would be fair to say that at that particular period, it would be hard to imagine a person that is more careful than he was in his engagements with outsiders. But generally speaking, you could still, even at the early stages, glean some things about him as a man and as a leader. Remarkably confident, very at ease, a kind of guy who would be prepared to sit down and have a beer late into the evening. The classic example here, though, is of a set of circumstances in which he came to the United States not for the first time as a leader, but as a student. And that early experience as an exchange student in Iowa made a big difference in how he saw the United States, and I think has created the context for a pragmatic, principled partnership between our two countries. So if you think about sort of the important elements of U.S. foreign policy in Asia over the course of the next 20 or 30 or 40 years, essentially what we are involved in is trying to define the contours of coexistence between the United States and China. And if you know anything about history or think a little bit about how countries interact, one of the most difficult set of circumstances is how countries work together during periods when you have a rising country rapidly amidst a status quo coexisting group of states in the neighborhood. No country has risen to great power status more rapidly than China has in history. It rivals and surpasses the rise of the United States at the early part of the last century. But the rise is very different in many respects. China rises to great power status with still a very large percentage of its population living in poverty, with a very determined set of economic goals and objectives, and still some ambivalence about what role it wants to play on the international stage. I think it would be fair to say that when the Obama administration came to power in 2009, it was in the midst of the worst economic crisis that we'd seen in 50 or 60 years. And most of our assessments suggested that our Chinese friends generally viewed the United States as being in a deep and irreversible decline, and that we would be out of Asia over the course of a couple of decades. I think today, 4 years later, 2013, I think there is a broad and general recognition, not just in China, but across Asia, that the United States has decades left of consequential power, and that we will be playing a role for years to come. China generally finds it challenging to be in a set of circumstances in which mutual goals can be undertaken in such a way that there's not a clear winner and a clear loser, right? So looking for positive sum outcomes is one of the most important things that we can accomplish in the current context of U.S.-China relations. So what we are seeking to do is to lay out a very broad and ambitious agenda across every aspect of foreign policy, national security, and intelligence, economics, that reflects the parameters of the 21st century. And just to give you a sense, I think it is very clear that from the U.S. perspective, we are all in. And we believe that focusing intensively and intently on the U.S.-China relationship is at the core of what it means to have an effective foreign policy in Asia. But it goes beyond there. Clearly, the contribution, I think, more than anything else that Secretary Clinton gave to the formulation and execution of Asian strategy is that good China policy must be embedded in a larger regional context. And so to do diplomacy effectively means not just flying to Beijing, but deepening relations across the board. And that's why you've seen much stronger ties with our allies, newfound focus on multilateral institutions that we've talked about earlier, bringing India out of its neighborhood, thinking more directly about the Asia-Pacific region, thinking not just about formal, larger multilateral engagements, but smaller ones, what we call mini-lateral meetings that involve the United States, Japan, and Australia, other countries as well. These circumstances are remarkably important going forward. But it does not end there. We've also worked hard to develop relations with countries who we've had remarkably little to do with for decades. So for instance, we had almost no strategic engagement with New Zealand since 1986. We are now on remarkably good terms, working closely together. That's very much in Australia's best interest as it is in ours. We're working with ASEAN as a whole, but also with the component pieces of ASEAN, including Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. And then obviously what was already discussed, reaching out and engaging Burma, Myanmar, in a way that I think offers promise for what was once the breadbasket, one of the most important countries of Southeast Asia, but for the last 50 years has faced remarkable internal struggles going forward. For the United States and China, we are really on the brink of a new period in our relationship with a new set of leaders. And every day, I was talking with Bates before we came out here, there's a reports breathless often in the newspaper about what we think we know about this new leadership and whether it's going to be focused on the military or these issues or that. The truth is, if one looks back at the period 8 or 9 years ago when Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao came into power, the same sort of breathless analysis. The truth is we do not know, and it will take some time, perhaps as long as a year, to get a sense of the character of the leadership and the areas of focus that we'll likely to see. No matter what, it is clear that the primary overriding objectives of Beijing will be to focus on domestic issues. Domestic issues, the transition in their economy, problems with corruption and overheating will command the lion's share of attention. And it really, in many respects, is foreign policy as an addendum to some of these domestic issues that we're dealing with. So for the United States, what we are seeking to do is to begin and continue a set of conversations between the United States and China that we believe will sustain the kind of partnership that we need. And we are trying to be very steady about it, very clear about it, why we think it's in our best interests, and working closely with countries who share our values and our interests in designing effective strategies for dealing with China. Now, I must say the difference that we see in this particular set of transitions, this hegemonic moment, is very different than periods in the past. And I'll give you a couple of examples if I can. I think in the situation, for instance, of Germany, both before the First World War and before the Second World War, enormous ambivalence and negativity in many quarters about their role in global politics. A very different set of circumstances today in Asia and the world. If anything, it's the United States, it's Australia, and other countries that are encouraging China to play a larger role in global politics, not denying them that role. It was the United States and Australia that championed China joining the G20. We work with them closely on joining the WTO. It is, in fact, China that is somewhat ambivalent about playing a larger role on the global stage, in which we are encouraging it and supporting it. It is also the case, if you're looking for clues about how the United States views and thinks about China, the best example is to look back over the last 40 or 50 years. Now, the truth is, finding these contours of coexistence will be very difficult for both of our countries. It'll be challenging anthropologically, politically, and strategically. But both leaders deep down on each side, both set of strategic thinkers, understand that it is necessary. It is inconceivable that we would find ourselves in a set of circumstances of sustained endemic tension between the United States and China. Nothing could be less in our interests, could be less in the interests of the region as a whole. But the coexistence that we're seeking to establish and define is perhaps different than some of the things that we occasionally read in Beijing. What we are hearing a lot right now is the idea of the reestablishment of Chinese power as opposed to the arrival of China fresh on the international scene. And what we are seeking is for China to integrate into a global community in such a way that there are shared norms, values, procedures that we work on to define together that are in all of our best interests. We do not want a world order that resembles more the 19th century with spheres of influence and uses of economic leverage on weaker or poorer states. We seek a set of procedures and norms that allow for negotiation and dialogue when there are differences on maritime issues, you name it. So what we're seeking to do is from top to bottom in the period ahead, literally in the weeks and months going forward, to sustain and deepen the relationship between the United States and China. At the top, really, is the meeting between the two leaders. And so I think you can expect soon more high-level communication and engagement between President Obama and President Xi Jinping. The challenge for us, just to keep in mind, is that how do you go about scheduling and engaging these two leaders when so much flows from those meetings, but the challenges are in the scheduling. So there are three ways that we meet and have met in the recent past. The one is when one leader comes to the United States or the United States president goes to China. The stakes cannot be higher for these meetings. They're remarkably difficult to prepare for, sometimes taking 6, 8, 10 months. It's very hard to use those as they're so loaded with face and representation as opposed to sort of doing business. The other time that we meet is around multilateral summits, when we are together in a country for APEC or ASEAN. And those sessions, invariably, they're scheduled for an hour and a half. We never get through the agenda, and we're rushing, and it goes on longer, and it's like just a car backup on the freeway with everyone waiting around for the next set of circumstances. And so clearly, there is a need of some innovation here. And one of the things that we did during the Soviet era, and again, I think both countries are wary of even thinking in those terms, but it became clear that Soviet and American leaders sometimes wanted to have an opportunity to meet outside of one of the other capitals, right? And so we're going to have to start thinking about the possibility of meeting in third places, in Asia and elsewhere, for more informal meetings that are not loaded with the kind of parameters that you would have in terms of going to one capital or the other. We need more informal engagement and more sustained high-level engagement between our two leaders going forward. The second issue are the mechanisms that are just below the leadership levels that basically structure dialogue between our two countries. For the last 4 years, they have been what is called the Strategic and Economic Dialogue that was led by the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Treasury. These happened once every year, but there were a number of meetings that took place around issues that were pertinent throughout the year. Some of those meetings would involve hundreds of people from agencies who had remarkably little contact with the United States or China. So it allowed a much deeper set of engagements between our two countries and our bureaucracies on issues like timber, conservation, coral reefs, you name it, every dentistry, just remarkable set of engagements that allowed for a deeper set of interactions between our two countries. The third issue that's going to be necessary is to step up our military dialogue. We have gone through periods in which we've had high-level engagement between our two militaries, and then we've gone through periods with remarkably little engagement between our two military establishments. It is essential that our two senior militaries get to know each other a little bit better, share perspectives. And in truth, it has been the United States that has been deeply desirous of this. But for a variety of reasons, Chinese friends have been a little bit ambiguous and sometimes difficult to tie down on this. Ultimately, the purpose of these discussions has to be to share strategic perspectives, but as importantly, while Chinese forces, military forces, invariably deploy further from their borders, they are going to rub up against American forces, right? And we need to establish rules of the road so that if there ever would be, God forbid, an incident or some sort of accident, we have to have procedures whereby, through communications, that we can alleviate a crisis before it occurs. And that is one of the most important things that can be accomplished in terms of U.S.-China relations. If there is greater confidence between our two military establishments, it will send a resounding message throughout the region as a whole. Now, I will say one of the great advantages of Australia is that you have a deeper military relationship with China, one that we support, we think makes sense, and we learn an enormous amount talking with Australian friends about what they learn in their interactions with China, and we think this is very much in the best interest of both countries. It is also the case that the United States and China must do more to cooperate in multilateral engagements, like the ASEAN Regional Forum, like APEC, like the East Asia Summit. I think too often it's perceived more as a competitive endeavor, but we need to set a clear determination that both countries understand that determining how we cooperate will be as important as anything else. Now, I will tell you quite honestly, over the last 5 years, every meeting that we went to, we would present China with specific areas. Let's cooperate on mango development in Papua New Guinea, on teachers in Timor, on water specialists in Vietnam or Indonesia. And most of the time, the answer was, it's difficult, it'll take time, we have to study it. But if you are persistent, if you're determined, I think over time we can wear down some of that opposition. And nothing will build stronger confidence between our two countries than actually exhibiting and experiencing cooperation. Cooperation on the ground. It is profoundly in the interest of both of our countries. And here again, Australia leads the way with much more engagement on assistance and the like with China. And this is another area where we need to draw out our Chinese friends. It is also the case that the dialogue between the United States and China, and indeed involving other countries, has to tackle some of the hardest challenges before us. And I'll give you just two as an example here. One is climate change. I think if you were giving out grades over the course of the last couple of years, I'm afraid that neither China nor the United States would get particularly good grades. But it is absolutely central to the overall endeavor to see a consequential effort on the part of the United States, China, India, other key states in Asia, Indonesia as well, to play a role in dealing with an issue that is upon us much more rapidly than people realize. And every study recognizes quite clearly that one of the regions hit the hardest by climate change, both in terms of the intensity of storms, number of people that will be on the move with respect to rising shorelines, will be Asia. Clearly, this is a manifest topic, and one that Secretary Kerry, in his first weeks in office, has spoke passionately about. And I think this is something that both the United States and China must put more focus on going forward. And the second is an issue that our National Security Advisor addressed in a very important speech 2 days ago at the Asia Society on cybersecurity. We are facing really an epidemic problem, in which almost all of our collective businesses, our industries, our government sites have been intruded upon from shadowy sources, sometimes unclear. Mr. Donlan laid out a very clear path for a strategic set of dialogues between the United States and China. I myself am relatively optimistic that we can make progress here, and there are a number of reasons for it. One of the things we often hear from Chinese friends is that we don't like these pre-existing regimes, like trade regimes and the like. We want to be able to be in on the ground floor in defining what are the precepts, what are the foundation points. That's exactly where we are in terms of the Wild West, which is essentially the cyber arena. So China can be on the ground floor to help define what parameters there would be that will guide the activities of nations going forward. It is also the case that if you think about what is the prime directive of Chinese foreign policy, more than anything else, it is do nothing that would lead to other countries forming in a collective group against you. Always seek to do foreign policy in such a way that there will not be a united front that is directed against Beijing. Essentially what indiscriminate attacks have done for years now is created a unified group of businesses and companies and governments that are extraordinarily anxious about this set of problems. And more Chinese friends hear from visitors about their anxiety about these practices. It is also the case that I find that Chinese friends who are asked about these issues, this internationalist group of people that travel more, that engage more with outsiders, they're clearly uncomfortable on this topic. And it's hard to sort of spout the line about, we have no idea where these come from and every nation is involved in it, those sort of general comments. So I think the preconditions are there for a very consequential set of discussions between the United States and not just China, but other countries as well, that will allow for some rules of the road to be established between the United States and China as we go forward. Ultimately, we are headed into a very different period in U.S.-China relations. It is the case, I sometimes will sit and meet with the architects of the opening to China. Now, many of them are approaching their later years in life, but were involved in this tremendous effort 40 and 50 years ago. And there's often the case of a feeling like, oh my God, can you handle this a little bit differently, or we would have done it differently, and this is not how it was done 40 or 50 years ago. The truth is that the strategies that you apply and employ when you're trying to lure out a primitive, xenophobic, not developed country 45 years, 50 years ago, and the strategies that you use today when you're trying to shape the goals and ambitions of a rising superpower are just night and day. And so the one thing I would tell most friends that are looking at U.S.-China relations, or indeed relations between Australia and China, is that a certain amount of steadiness is necessary. And that if there is no tension in your interaction, then it is a sure sign that you're not doing your job. Because by nature, the relationship is complicated and complex, and there should be a degree of tension in interactions. And in fact, our economic relationship with China is much more complicated. We have supplier, manufacturing, and investment, where primarily Australia's with China is one of provision of natural resources. So it leads to different perspectives, different qualities to the engagement. But overall, as you deal with Chinese friends, you have to be prepared for some tension in their interactions going forward. And in fact, Chinese friends expect that. They believe that that is an essential feature in any set of interactions. I've been involved over the course of the last couple of years in a host of challenging diplomatic engagements on Iran, on North Korea, on maritime security, on the blind dissident Chen Guangchen. Literally thousands of hours of diplomacy. And I believe that one of the things that Chinese friends respect the most is a principled approach, the strength of your convictions, and a determination to hold a steady course. And that's something that I think both the United States and Australia share. Ultimately, there is occasionally debate in Australia about whether Australia needs to trend in one direction or the other. My own advice to you generally is that you've done it just about right. You have an excellent long-term relationship of values and ideals between the United States and Australia. It's based on a shared set of achievements and aspirations in terms of peace and prosperity in Asia. And you have an extraordinarily important trading and growing financial and trading relationship between Australia and China. Both of those relationships are in your best interest. The United States supports a stronger relationship between Australia and China. No powerful country in Asia, no smart country in Asia is being pressured to rethink its relationship with the United States. And indeed, every influential nation in Asia has a good relationship with both the United States and China. And that really, I think, is the path forward for Australia going forward. And in that process, I think it is often the case that the depth and the dimensions of the U.S.-Australian relationship are not as well understood. I don't think there is as much recognition of how deep our economic relationship is, the challenges that we've faced together, and in fact, our shared aspirations on common challenges like China. So with that, I think we'll go to question and answer. Ultimately, I'm quite bullish not only about continuing the so-called American pivot to Asia, but I'm also bullish on the U.S.-Australian relationship, and I believe deeply that we will continue to work closely together, and ultimately, the challenge of the 21st century will be whether the United States can get the diplomacy towards Beijing right. And I and others will do everything possible to see that we do. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks.
I should say, I didn't say it before. I see some very distinguished former friends, former diplomats in the audience, John McCarthy and the ambassador here, and I just want to pay my respects to both of them and others, so thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kurt. Great set of remarks. I think you've really laid a very rich table for all of us to partake. I want to maybe just raise one question for you to try and respond and get things rolling. We were in D.C. With a delegation of Australia-based officials and experts. You very kindly spoke to us while we were there. It was during the sequester week, the Friday, March 1st sequester date. And I want to get your thoughts on how can we grapple this aspect of the rebalancing to the ground and assure the effective re-engagement or the effective deepening of our engagement in Asia. In some respects, it strikes me that, rightly or wrongly, the perceptions out there have overly focused on the, let's call it the military dimensions of the rebalancing. There, more clearly, cutbacks in budgetary resources, have a direct connection. Yeah. But it strikes me that there would be many more, perhaps more effective and less expensive elements of the rebalancing that ought to be given more profile. Have you met this perception as you've been going around the region?
Yeah.
And how do you address these issues?
What I would do, Bates, is unpack what you're saying into a couple of different compartments, which frankly we hear everywhere we go. The first is that the quality of our democracy and the quality of our system. There are many questions about whether the United States is, quote, quote, working, whether our system of government is effectively working. And you hear that not just in China, but across Asia. And it's a classic set of experiences, and I'll just give you one, if I can, on that, Bates. I remember we were traveling with Secretary Clinton, and we were going to go to Hong Kong, and she was going to give the classic American speech of here's what you need to do, right? Here are the 5 things that you've got to do in terms of economic reforms and market opening and the future of Trans-Pacific Partnership. But we were there only a couple of days before one of the budget shutdowns. And I remember as we were flying in, any of these speeches bureaucratically are done inside the Secretary's office, but it's only until you're on the trip that you're able to kind of interject. And I remember as we were landing, I said, Madam Secretary, you're going to find very quickly when you're there that this is not what the region wants to hear right now. They don't want to hear about what we think about them. They want to hear about what we're going to do, right? And as soon as we landed, it became incredibly clear that we need to be able to persuade that we have the ability to deal with our challenges. I love the line that Bob Carr often uses, which is the United States is one big budget deal away from dealing with and putting down any conception of American decline. I just hope we get that budget deal. So that's the first dimension, and I think that's accurate. And the other part of that, Bates, is that you can't dispel that with talking points. You got to do it with actions, and that will take time. The second dimension is, and this is ironic, even though there has been talk about the rebalance or pivot has been primarily militarily, that's just wrong. This has been a diplomatic engagement by and large with very little military engagement. Our military is primarily focused in terms of operations in the Middle East and South Asia. But what we have are 2 things that are interesting that are coexisting simultaneously. The first is in our government, we have one part of our government that is essentially on steroids, which is our military and our intelligence. And then the rest of our government is on life support, right? And so this is a complex and difficult imbalance for someone who works in government to deal with. And I'll just give you an example. I had been in the Navy, I'd worked in the Department of Defense. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that I'd work in the State Department. And now it was the most wonderful experience of my life, even though we don't have the resources to do our job. We have to use our guile and our cunning in every set of circumstances, building coalitions and engagements with other countries going forward. So that's the first part of that, but there's a second thing as well. The irony about what's happened in terms of how to interpret complex dynamics in Asia. This period of the last 5 years has actually coexisted with a revolutionary development in the United States that is not as widely understood, which is the absolute complete demise of journalism as a walk of life, right? And so it's not as much in Asia yet, but frankly, it's, we'll see how dynamics play out. But if 10 years ago, you could name 10 or 15 extraordinarily distinguished Asian correspondents who really understood the dynamics of what was going on. Almost all of those people have left the field. Almost all of them have. And so in the last 10 years, we have created a new breed of correspondent. And 99% of them have cut their teeth in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so they have a certain set of skills and a certain set of perspectives that they bring to bear when they look at Asia. So the tendency is to think more in terms of military issues and conflict that are utterly they're utterly unfamiliar and unhelpful in interpreting the developments in Asia as a whole. Now, the last point I would say, and sorry to go on so long, Bates, is what will the sequester mean for our ultimate ability to engage in Asia, and whether we will have some sort of compromise in the budget. And the truth is, I just don't know the answer to that. What's happening right now is that the elements of the sequester are being presented in such a way to make them appear extremely divisive and really interrupting services. And so as a result, they make people very anxious about what's going to happen not only at home with White House tours and the like, but what's going to happen with the conduct of American diplomacy. And I myself, as we looked at our budgets at the State Department, over the last 2 years, we got dramatic increases, badly needed increases, right? And so for someone like me who comes into the State Department, if you landed from Mars in the State Department, our great institution of diplomacy, you would think it was the 1980s or 1970s, that Europe ruled the roost, followed closely by the Middle East, and that Asia was this little kind of sequestered group of people, very content with their languages and their culture, but not interested in running anything. That has to completely change. So there has to be recognition that the dominant institution inside the State Department is our bureau, the bureau that is responsible for Asia. But those institutions are the last to change, and they're very difficult to change during periods where budgets are going down.
It's going to be a tough challenge for sure. Thanks a lot for that, Kurt. Kurt's been very kind to offer up maybe another 20, 30 minutes before we break for reception. So if you'd be kind enough to just identify yourself and ask a brief question or make a brief comment for Kurt, that'd be great. Thank you.
Chris Skinner. I'm a visiting lecturer at Sydney University,
Great.
But my interest is broader than that. Last week it was announced in the American media that China had overtaken the US as the largest importer of oil. And this was quite an interesting development. Professor Hugh White last year predicted that the biggest challenge for China was energy security. How can the US help that?
Well, the irony is that in the next several years, the United States has the potential to move towards almost energy self-sufficiency with vast new resources of shale oil and liquid natural gas, new oil deposits, and coal, and bringing other alternative sources of energy on station. The needs that China faces on the energy front are just massive. And they are, from a climate perspective, destabilizing going forward. But it also is increasingly distorting energy flows to all of Asia. Distorting in the sense of so much is required in China generally to sustain growth. The primary contribution that the United States has made, which is significant, is the maintenance of peace and stability in the Middle East and South Asia. And that's something that can't be dismissed. You know, when we were talking about the role that the United States has provided in China's arrival on the global stage, in the last 45 years, you could make the argument is probably the best 45 years in China's history. So what does the United States and others have done to support that? First, a secure and steady flow of energy resources from the Middle East and South Asia. So China's military, which is growing rapidly, is not designed to do that. It is designed to interdict and to do near-in operations in places closer to China's borders, but it has not provided the global common good that the Seventh Fleet and the United States, working with other nations, has done in terms of the provision of secure oil and gas from the Middle East. Secondly is the openness of our markets. Frankly, the vast share of what China has produced, which has led to enormous wealth creation, has gone to the United States. And even though that is diversifying over the last 40 years, that has been remarkable. Also, along with Australia and other countries, remarkable investment into China. And so I think what we have seen is a commitment to China's arrival on the global stage, including in terms of energy security. Ultimately, the challenge for all of us, and in our conversations with China on energy issues, it is one of those issues that they cannot solve on their own. And one of the occasional challenges that we have when the United States and China get together, we are both countries that are occasionally somewhat uncomfortable with interdependence, right? But the truth is we live in a profoundly interdependent world, and on at least energy, there are no solutions that one country can take alone, at least on the global marketplace, that doesn't involve the actions and activities of other countries.
Thanks, Kurt. Hina?
Nina Silov from the U.S. Studies Center.
Hi.
Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
It's
I
great to
think
be here.
that your message is a very useful one because it provides a corrective, I think, to the debate here in Australia. It undermines the premise of the question of whether Australia needs to choose the United States and China. I have a slightly more specific question to ask you, and that is if you could please say something about the relationship as you see it between the pivot to Asia policy and the global posture review, which you wrote about in Foreign Affairs in 2003, either to compare the two policies for the point of helping us to understand the pivot towards Asia better, or to explain if there are continuities between those two policies, and if so, how the pivot to Asia substantively adds upon the global posture review.
Thank you. And I think what you're referring to, and again, it's been a long time since that. I mean, there have been two posture reviews since that one. The one that you're referring to was articulated by Don Rumsfeld, the last Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, first Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration. And that particular approach had it that the United States would pull some of its forces back from forward deployments, and then would use them in the United States and surge, would send them out in the event of conflict. I think one of the questions and concerns that people have is that military forces are used for a number of things. In Asia, our argument would be that they're most important not in terms of fighting wars, even though they have to be prepared for that. They shape the environment that we live in, and the presence of American soldiers, sailors, and Marines has provided sort of oil on the waters, reassurance to a number of nations going forward. And so personally, that sort of impetus in 2003, I would have gone the other direction, because I think it's so important in terms of presence and engagement and joint capacity. And I think we're seeing more of that going forward. Now the key here is how to increase and diversify our military engagement in such a way that does not lead China to believe that we are embarked on a containment strategy. And I hear this a lot in Asia generally, but I will just simply say to you, what's different from this containment strategy that it was applied to the Soviet Union and the circumstances today, which are again night and day, and it's so unhelpful to have that sort of residue of thinking as you confront and try to think creatively about dealing with China. The truth is every country in Asia wants a better relationship with China. Every country does, and including the United States. Now, it is also the case that every country in Asia wants the United States around and believes that for a more active American role, even on the security side, provides the ability to engage effectively and some reassurance in difficult times. Ultimately, I think over a period of the next 10 to 15 years, you will see American engagement continue in Northeast Asia. You'll see more in Southeast Asia generally. We'll work more closely with countries like India and Australia. And the hope is that we will be able to also work more with China. Every year, there are numerous requests to get China to participate in peacekeeping and joint activities and engagements with other countries. They've been largely ambivalent, but I believe that the time going forward, it is of manifest importance to encourage them to engage going forward. Ultimately, the framework here has got to be one of cooperation, not decline, not domination, but working together as part of a collective group of nations that are committed to maintenance of peace and stability in Asia going forward.
There's a gentleman at the back there. Yeah, please. Oh, I'm sorry. I was pointing to the man with the microphone. Excuse me.
Yeah, Kerry Brown from the China Studies Centre, University of Sydney. I just have a question about North Korea. Do you think this new leadership are going to finally maybe start thinking about walking away from North Korea? I mean, they've been saying, academics in China have been saying rather more adventurous things. Do you think that finally they might think the unthinkable? And secondly, I'd be interested, what's your interpretation of Kim Jong-un's incredibly bellicose language lately? I mean, do you think this is posturing? What's the American red line with this? What do you do with it?
Great question. The first thing I would say is, and I appreciate the nuance of both questions. China will never quote, walk away from the Korean Peninsula. They can't and they wouldn't. However, you are right. There is a robust debate underway about North Korea inside China. And there is a broader recognition that if this is a buffer state, what's it good for, right? Because everything North Korea is doing is actually undermining China's influence and its interest in the region. So they are profoundly unhappy with it, and it is triggering all sorts of things that are not in China's best interests. The irony is that China has practiced towards North Korea what I would call soft diplomacy, right? Very careful, very kid gloves, extremely respectful. They will only meet when North Korea wants to. If you experience the interaction, you would have a tough time telling which was the dominant state and which was the failing backward state, right? And so I think what's likely to happen as the reconsideration goes is that China might think more about maybe treating North Korea, shall we say, like the Philippines, right? Brutal, tough, we're the boss, here's the set of circumstances that you need to understand. Now, how they couch that, how that goes, we'll see. Ultimately, again, they can't walk away, but they are deeply unhappy by what we've seen over the course of the last 2 years. Now, on North Korea generally, I can't say I'm in any way proud of this, but I do find it rather unusual. Like, so I've been working on Asia, like with Bates, for about 30 years. I have literally a completely, utterly unblemished record, and I'm not exaggerating, of failure on North Korea. Every single prediction, every single one has been wrong. So I was certain that it was a boiler failure when the Chonan went down. It seemed incredible to me that the small mini submarine could have done such a thing. And so it makes me incredibly reluctant to give judgments about what's going on. However, I think it's hard not to be somewhat alarmed, right? Somewhat concerned by incredibly bellicose language, a lot of sort of toing and froing, and ironically, Madam Park, I had a chance to meet her before she took the oath of office. We had a chance to discuss. It's very clear that the new South Korean government wanted, probably still wants, to have a different kind of relationship with North Korea. North Korea is making it almost impossible to begin that dialogue. And so I don't know what to expect, but generally speaking, the level of anxiety around Asia with respect to North Korea is very high and growing.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back to that poor guy who started.
Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Thank you. Thomas Barlow from Barlow Advisory. Actually, the last question is a nice lead-in for my question. I was amused by your observation that the US government is a bifurcated one, with part of it on steroids and part of it on life support. Given that in the last federal budget, I believe 1.6 trillion was spent on Medicare, Medicaid and Social Security combined, which is more than 2.5 times what was spent on defence. I'd be interested in your observations as to how that constitutes government spending on life support.
Are you talking about? You're talking about the United States? Yeah. Okay. What I was referring to were other aspects of foreign policy, not on domestic support. Clearly, we spent an enormous amount on health care and on retirement and Medicare. That was not what I was referring to. I was talking about what I would call the instruments of foreign policy, which are normally thought to be our military power, USAID, our assistance, and our State Department budgets. The Defense Department budget has gone like this, and the others have gone like that, generally. And so that's all I was referring to.
Are you concerned that expenditures in other areas on the domestic front will constrain the US's capacity to respond militarily, let's say, to the threat, that's the potential threat posed by a country like North Korea?
Well, I think if you're asking the question, do I think there needs to be deep structural negotiations about how to raise new revenues and deal with long-term entitlements, I think most people in the United States would argue that's going to be necessary. What are the terms of the debate? If we can't address those problems, then we will not be able to sustain the global leadership going forward. So I completely agree with that. There's a great book that's just about to come out, a good friend of Bates and I's, Richard Haass, who's a wonderful writer, he's head of the Council on Foreign Relations, and his book is entitled Foreign Policy Begins at Home, in which he makes the argument for exactly what you're saying, and he's suggesting that if we don't get our domestic house in order, largely to do with long-term spending and massive shortfalls in terms of the problems that we'll face in terms of entitlements and the like, then we won't be unable, perhaps not immediately, but over time, to undertake the kind of ambitious foreign policy that we have come accustomed to. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
My name's Rawdon Dalrymple. I understood you to say towards the end of your very interesting address that every one of the United States' friends in Asia has a satisfactory relationship with China. I found that a bit surprising, given what I keep on hearing about opinion in Japan and a lot of American opinion about the situation in Japan vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, and sorry, if I said that, that's not what I had meant to say or believe, neither. What I said was, and what I thought I was trying to convey, is that in fact every country in Asia, every single country wants a better relationship with China. Sometimes they don't know how to do it. I just came from Japan. I met with Prime Minister Abe. Very clear, but it's the parameters, what's involved in that. So everyone understands how important it is. But in fact, a lot of countries have very tense relations with China right now, and that is likely to be the case for the period ahead. And so the point I'm making, though, is that just because relations are difficult, it does not mean that countries want to band together in some sort of containment strategy. That's not it at all. What they're looking for is how to work with other countries to change the nature of the dialogue in a manner that will lead to outcomes that all countries can feel more comfortable about working together collaboratively. I think that's more of what I was trying to convey.
Kurt, let me turn that inside out for a second, get your quick thoughts on this. I mean, how is it possible to be optimistic about a future stable and constructive relationship with China when China itself, I think, views itself as being in an insecure place, given the domestic challenges, given the enormous problems at home of corruption, environmental issues, a third of the country being, in one way or another, connected with ethnic potential separatist movements surrounded by 14, 15, 16 countries, territorial disputes still existing. It's a big agenda. Should we be surprised that a country with that sort of an agenda is going to be, prickly, defensive?
No. And
what do we do?
Bates said it exactly right. That's the China that we live with and that we engage with. They have enormous anxieties, uncertainties about the motives of other countries, and they are indeed prickly on critical issues, and that will continue going forward. But my abiding belief, though, Bates, is that the strategic elite of China for 50 years have believed that on balance, it is in their strategic interests to have a workable, predictable, generally stable, intense relationship between the United States and China. And I believe that will continue for some time. And so the key here is think of the U.S.-China relationship as a vessel. And what I try to hope for and work towards is that what we do not want is some small amount of competition in a larger vessel of cooperation, but the reverse, competition, occasional tensions in a larger containing context of strategic cooperation. It's hard, you have to strive for it, you have to be committed to it, but it is essential going forward. And let me just, Bates said a great point, and I want to give you one anecdote that will help you capture for you how even sophisticated Chinese friends think about it. I won't go into great detail, but there is one person I dealt with more than anyone else, a person I would call a friend, and I had enormous trust in him, and I worked with him on some of the hardest diplomatic issues. And I remember during the hardest point of this blind dissident, Chen Guangchen, who came into our embassy, and we had very hard diplomacy around his departure and then ultimately leaving China for the United States. At one point during our hours around-the-clock deliberation, he asked me, and he was dead serious. He said, "Kurt, I need you to tell me the truth. Did you plan this? Did you orchestrate this? Did the United States orchestrate this?" And this was a true question. This is a belief. And in many quarters of China right now, there is a view that the United States is deeply involved in a conspiracy and lots of different nefarious actions. It is our job to confront that head on. What I always tried to do in diplomacy was to try to shape questions in such a way that we were not working against one another, but that we'd set collectively a goal and that we would work together towards that goal, and that goal would be defined in such a way that it would be in both of our best interests.
Thank you. This gentleman here has been waiting also.
We should go with a woman as to Betsy. I know we're in Australia, but still.
There we go. Fair enough.
Thank you. I was just thinking only one woman's asked a question so far. I appreciate that. Deborah Snow from the Sydney Morning Herald. Mr. Campbell, in an interview last year, our Defence Chief, General David Hurley, I asked him a question and I said, what's the thing that most keeps you awake at night? And he said, what most keeps me awake at night is the relationship between the US and China militaries. Now, I wonder if that's something that keeps you awake at night. Do you believe the kind of engagement and approach that you've outlined earlier is one that feeds through to the US military machine in terms of State Department to military communication? On a second, slightly related question, I'd just like to ask you also about your view on the cuts to our defence budget. It's been reduced to a proportion of GDP spending that's about as low as it was at the end of the Second World War. What your view is on that, whether that's something that Australia needs to redress in terms of its standing in engagement with China. And just thirdly, I'm sorry to cram so many in, related to that, is there concern in the US about the possibility that Australia might downgrade the number of submarines it's going to acquire? I think 12 were suggested in the 2009 Defence White Paper.
Thanks. On the first question, I mean, I think sometimes there is this view that the U.S. military has some nefarious plan or set of engagements for China. In fact, the senior military in Hawaii and elsewhere are deeply, profoundly engaged in wanting a constructive dialogue with China. And they work around the clock to create venues of discussion and engagement. And by and large, it has been the ambivalence and the occasional decision on the part of China to abstain from certain of those discussions that has been the biggest challenge that we've faced. And I think a concerted effort on the part of all nations to underscore that it is in the profound interest of all countries to see the United States and China militaries working collaboratively and having deep dialogue. If we can accomplish that in the near term, that would be one of the most important features of modern diplomacy. And I will say that would be something that would not be new. We used to have that kind of relationship in the past, and we need to recreate it again, and it's very important. And the United States military is frustrated often that they find that invitations are rebuffed, Chinese friends don't come to various things, they don't participate in multilateral diplomacy, even disaster relief and such. And so as China rises and spends so much more money on its military, we hope that they will play a larger role in the multilateral military and defense diplomacy that is increasingly dominating the geography of Asia going forward. Secondly, look, I'm not going to involve myself in the domestic decisions about budgets and the like. I will say that the neighborhood in China around Australia has become more complicated. And that's just undeniably the case. And so defense budgets are a subject of discussion and debate in the United States. They should be in other democratic countries. We count on a strong commitment and engagement on the part of Australia, and we want that to continue going forward. On the exact numbers, look, there are controversies about submarines, about the fighter program and the like. We want a strong, robust Australian commitment to working closely with us on the most sophisticated and best military equipment on the planet, and generally speaking, we've been satisfied with those interactions over time. I know that this is a subject of debate currently in Australia. I think we have had quiet discussions and have received assurances about Australia's strong commitment to want to work with the United States going forward, and I think we've been satisfied by those.
Thank you, Kurt. this gentleman here, and then I know some people have been waiting patiently in the back, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up.
Great, thanks.
And please, more than 2 women can raise their hands for...
I was just teasing Bates, by the way.
Now I feel really bad. My name is Jamie Ryan. I have a question about the other hotspot in Northeast Asia. You recently said you were in Japan, and so I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the Senkaku or Diaoyu Island. Particularly, I guess, what, in light of the pivot strategy over the past few years, what is the proper role, what potential can the U.S. play in this island dispute? Particularly, what are the nature of conversations that yourself and others can have with Japanese counterparts and with China? Is there a role the U.S. has in this dispute, or is it in fact not something that the U.S. needs to be too involved in? Thanks.
Well, look, I'm not going to, even though I'm out of government, there are certain things that probably best left quietly handled. We are, and we were, and we will continue to be deeply involved behind the scenes. We do not believe it is appropriate for the United States to play a mediating role, and neither do either parties want that. But it is the case that we've encouraged dialogue. We've made suggestions about how to increase trust and confidence in a very delicate time. Our position on the Senkakus, what the Japanese call Senkakus, what our Chinese friends call the Diaoyu is a very nuanced position, and one that is sometimes difficult to explain. First, we ultimately do not take a position on the ultimate sovereignty of these small rocks that are at the end of the Ryukyu chain, right? They were granted to Japan in terms of administrative control in 1972 with the reversion of Okinawa. And we have stated quite clearly that since 1972, we believe that Japan has demonstrated effective administrative control over these islands. And that lastly, because these islands are administered effectively by Japan, they do fall under the security treaty that the United States believes is one of the foundations of the maintenance of peace and stability in Northeast Asia. But in truth, the larger reality is one that we think is more important. And that is that if you look at what's happening in the global economy, we have still no growth in Europe. It will take a substantial period before that picks up. Growth is only beginning again in the United States. Northeast Asia is the cockpit of the global economy, right? And in many respects, everything that we've seen in terms of corollary growth in Southeast Asia and elsewhere has been based on the underpinnings of a financial and manufacturing understanding and arrangement that has been forged over decades between Japan and China, often in difficult circumstances. And that we think that that needs to continue, and that people have to take a larger and higher perspective, and that in this set of circumstances, cooler heads must prevail. We ultimately believe it's for those countries to decide, but some of these issues are very hard to resolve. And sometimes the best that you can do is export a problem into the future. Now, I will say again, over the last 4 or 5 years, it would be hard to describe how many hours I've done diplomacy on issues associated with maritime disputes. Everything I've done, everything I've worked on, this is the hardest set of issues in which I have felt diplomats had the least flexibility, were most anxious, most fearful about how they would be treated at home, and with absolutely no maneuver room. Ultimately, I believe that in all of these circumstances, there will need to be a framework for a larger dialogue. It makes it hard for the United States to talk about a framework and procedures and norms and rules when we ourselves are not a signatory to the Law of the Sea Convention. But it is essentially the case that many of the aspects of how you would deal with these very complex legal and maritime dispute issues are found in that document. Right now, in terms of both the East China Sea and the South China Sea, we want cooler heads to prevail. We want, if anything, to not see provocative actions, military, coast guards, and leaders in countries to recognize the risks involved. This is not a new set of issues, and the truth is that this remarkable prosperity that we've seen in Asia in the last 40 or 50 years was done even though these issues existed. And so it is again going to be necessary to put them aside and focus on the larger set of circumstances. But it is undeniable that the Senkaku Diaotai issues have done damage to the U.S.-China, to the Japan-China relationship. And there are some studies that indicate, yesterday was the anniversary of the tragedy that struck Japan 2 years ago. And that economic tragedy has been quantified, and it's enormous, right? By some calculations, the economic damage done to Japan and China since the Senkakus is greater, right? That's how significant these circumstances are. And what we have consistently tried to do is to convey to Japan and China the need to put these issues aside, to focus more on the future, rebuild trust and confidence. It will be enormously challenging going forward, and I just can't understate that enough. And the U.S. role has to be very, very careful. And trust me, everyone is trying to maneuver you or get you in one position or another, trying to keep a clear set of strategic principles and values in place at the same time that you're not alienating one party or the other is one of the hardest things that you could possibly imagine.
I'm afraid we're just going to have time for just one more. If this gentleman here, right there, Melissa? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you. It's Jeff from University of Sydney. So a few hours ago, China just elected the new president of China, which is President Xi Jinping, and also the vice president. So President Xi and Vice President Li, they both of them spent some time in the United States when they were young. So what do you think about the future regarding the China-U.S. relationship under this new elected president? Also, President Xi, when he was a vice president, a few years ago, he had very harsh comments on the foreign countries. What he said was China doesn't export revolution to the other country, and China doesn't export poverty to other country, and China doesn't care.
I'm familiar with the rumors.
Yeah, we don't care about the business of other countries. So in this case, the foreign countries should not worry about our business. So it's kind of, in one side, President Xi, last year, President Xi visited the United States, and he said he had very good impression when he was in the United States. But on the other side, President Xi had very harsh comments on the foreign countries. So what do you think about the future of the China-United States relationship? In other countries, actually many top Chinese officials, they have children or relatives in United States. Like the daughter of President Xi actually studied in Harvard University. In the case of so many high-rank Chinese officials, they have relatives or children in the United States. Do you think they will have better relationship with the United States? Thank you.
It's a great question, and I'll try to answer it this way. When I was at the State Department, we were talking about what's happening with resources, the gentleman's question. In the past, when you had a good idea about something, you build some new initiative, you'd go to Congress, and then you'd appropriate the money, and you'd launch a program. That period is just over, right? If anything of interest, you've got to establish some sort of public-private partnership, work with groups or foundations or corporations on the outside. when we started government in 2009, I actually had an idea, and I said, look, what's clear is that the number of Chinese students that are coming to the United States is growing exponentially. And the number of students that are going from the United States to China are not growing as fast as we'd like. So we launched an initiative called 100,000 Strong, the idea that over 4 years we would take the total number of American students that would go to China to 100,000, right? And we raised, you know, tens of millions of dollars, and we assisted in new students who would not normally have the opportunity, you know, not Eastern, well-educated, rich, largely females going to China. Minority colleges, 2-year programs, and so a huge number of new Americans over the course of the last 4 years have gone to China to study. And last month, the 100,000 Strong Foundation was launched with substantial resources to try to further that goal. And you know, in government, you could say, oh, well, that's not that important. We have to do diplomacy. The truth is that one of the most important things that we can do is to increase the societal engagement between our two countries. Nothing is more important than a larger number of Americans studying in China and the corresponding number of Chinese coming to the United States. I believe it is of fundamental importance. And I think quietly, although it is not always demonstrated, I think the experience of studying and living in the United States does make a difference. I do believe it does. And it makes a difference not in the ways always that you would expect. It doesn't mean that you love the United States and that you think it's great. In fact, a lot of my interlocutors know the United States very well and see its weaknesses. But in fact, it's the ability to see the totality of the society that I think can be helpful. I think one of the most important things about a Chinese visitor that really comes to know the United States is that it goes right at the heart of the idea that we're involved in some nefarious campaign against China. And likewise, if we increase the number of Americans that go to study in China, what message does that send? It says that we're prepared to entrust our most sacred thing, our children, to you to learn more about your country. So personally, I have very high hopes for that kind of exchange, and I'm on the board. I spend a lot of time raising money for it. I care about that endeavor very much. I think we don't know what kind of leader, honestly, that Xi Jinping is going to be. And you can sift through his comments when he was in Los Angeles last year, or what he said when we were with the vice president, or what he said in these comments that you referred to 5 years ago. The truth is we just do not know, and the circumstances have changed. But we do have people on the standing committee in which we have some experience. Both Xi and Li have had experience in the United States. And further down, Wang Xishan is probably the most experienced, familiar Chinese official with the United States ever to serve at that level. So we have some people that understand and are prepared to deal with us, and I think that's the best that we can do.
Well, Kurt, I think on that very positive note, you've once again, I think, underscored the message I think you would very much like us to take away today, and that is that we should certainly not over-exaggerate the potential problems that may lie between the United States and China, and that certainly leaders on both sides of the country, both sides of the Pacific, in China and the United States, I think recognize very clearly the outstanding importance of assuring that in spite of the problems, the two countries continue to see it in their long-term strategic interest to have a stable and productive relationship. You, over the past 4 years, along with your many colleagues at the State Department and elsewhere across government, worked very hard, I think, to see that that vision was continued. And I think we would all agree that even though you're stepping away from government, for the time being at least, you'll continue to be, I think, an advocate in this new capacity for these types of outcomes. And for that, I think we're all very, very grateful. Especially grateful you've been able to take time out of your very busy schedule in Australia to meet with us today.
Can I just want to say also how thrilled we are to have Bates, who I worked with for many years, coming to take the helm at the center. Secretary Clinton helped launch his new period when she was here for the OSMIN. He is the best, not only understands the U.S. And Australia well, but probably knows more about China than he's forgotten more than I'll ever know. So it's great to have him here. And I want you all, if you all run into my daughter, I want you to let her know that I accommodated myself well, that I understood the technology, and that I did not act disoriented. Okay?